100 years ago this year, on a hill outside a town in northern Bavaria, Richard Wagner opened the theatre of his dreams, a revolutionary theatre designed for the first complete performance of the 4 gigantic operas that make up The Ring. His was an impossible vision, but this is the story of how he and his family, over 3 successive generations, tried to make it possible here in Bayreuth. Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, was the culmination of Wagner's epic. He was aiming to give the audience a total experience, a fusion of sight, sound and drama of a kind which had never existed before. He chose to try it in Bayreuth because the town was isolated, because he wanted his audience to concentrate on the Ring with no distractions. The whole idea demanded altogether exceptional facilities, and he first came to Bayreuth to look at this theatre, the 18th century Margrave Theatre, because it had the largest stage in Germany. It was, and still is, a superb building, but it didn't suit his purpose because the auditorium was too small. It only held a few hundred, and he wanted more than just a large stage, no matter how elaborately decorated. He wanted to break away from all the old ideas of theatre design. He needed a functional stage in a theatre unlike anything else in the world. Bayreuth today still looks like an improbable place for Wagner to have chosen to present something that had no precedent in operatic history. In The Ring, Wagner created a saga concerned with gods and goddesses, giants and dragons, dwarfs and toads. It's a whole world of magic. It presents an endless challenge. It still remains his impossible vision. Yet from the start, The Ring captured the imagination of the musical world and put Bayreuth indelibly on the map. There's evidence of Wagner everywhere, in the streets named after members of his family or characters from his works. 60,000 visitors come to Bayreuth for the festival, and so for 1 month in the year, the population is doubled. And today, Wagner's big business for the shops in Bayreuth, teeming with Wagner books and Wagner records and Wagneriana of every imaginable kind. From its beginnings 100 years ago, the Bayreuth Festival has been a family affair, a Wagner family affair, never passing out of family hands, though each successive generation evolved different styles of production. But it's Richard Wagner who continues to draw people to Bayreuth to hear his music in his theatre. For the past 10 years, Wolfgang Wagner, the composer's younger grandson, has not only handled all the administration of the festival, but has established his reputation as a producer. Every day for a month, the pilgrims climb the green hill to the theatre. For 10 months of the year, not too much happens in Bayreuth, and then suddenly, each July, there's a volcano of activity. An orchestra has to be assembled and rehearsed. A chorus has to be found. They're not regular institutions. They have to be marshalled afresh every year. But then, Bayreuth's a magnet, drawing together not only orchestra and chorus and some of the greatest singers in the world, but a devoted and committed audience. The major attraction is inevitably the ring. In this centenary year, there'll be 4 complete cycles of a new production. Each cycle is spread over 6 days, which is an extremely civilized way to present it, because a work of such dimensions and implications needs a lot of afterthought. There'll also be 6 performances of Parsifal and 6 of Tristan and Isolde, as well as a festive opening on July 23rd with the final scene of Die Meistersinger. It seems easy enough in theory, but to get it all together, to make it work smoothly and efficiently, is a gigantic task. But at the heart of it, there's one man, Wolfgang Wagner, who manages the shop, and who is at the center of everything, organizing, producing, and being a genial host to the world. In 1871, Wolfgang's grandfather, Richard Wagner, with Semper, his architect, began to draw plans for a temporary theater, unlike any other in the world, though it was clearly influenced by the ancient Greek amphitheater. The auditorium is fan-shaped, with a very steep rake to ensure that every member of the audience of almost 2,000 has a perfect, unimpeded view of the stage. It's sparse, functional, and without any elaborate decoration, which was a huge departure from the conventional European opera house, shaped like a horseshoe. Another innovation was Wagner's idea of making the orchestra disappear by burying it deep below audience level and extending it backwards beneath the stage. This kind of pit can accommodate an orchestra of 130 players, though it does create problems for the conductor, who often hears more of the orchestra than he does of what's going on the stage. But the greatest innovation of all was Wagner's idea of separating orchestra and conductor from the audience by means of a great curved cowl or hood. Pessimists predicted that the sound would be ruined, but it wasn't. The Bayreuth acoustic is famous the world over, but it derives not so much from the cowl as from the fact that the theatre is made largely of wood and plaster. For even after 100 years, it's still a temporary building, though nobody today would dream of touching it because it's perfect for its purpose. Wagner needed this huge stage with its gigantic tower to hold scenery which could be raised and lowered silently and quickly, because his concept for the ring demanded, among lots else, a string of transformation scenes during which he didn't want the curtains to be closed. He was creating a mythical world, a world which would arouse primeval responses in the audience through symbols like fire, storms, rainbows and floods, but above all, through his music. Yet functional problems still had to be solved, and one was ventilation. The stage area in Bayreuth got so hot that eventually a kind of lid had to be fitted into the roof, which can be raised to let in reviving fresh air for scene shifters as well as the singers. By himself, Wagner could never have raised the money for Bayreuth. It was King Ludwig of Bavaria, his fanatical admirer, who came to the rescue when the patronage subscription system failed. Ludwig personally supplied the funds, which turned the plans into a reality and made it possible for Wagner to lay the foundation stone on his 59th birthday in 1872 with some typically enigmatic words. Here I enclose a secret. Here may it repose many hundred years. So long as the stone preserves it, so long will it manifest itself. Wagner then went on personally to supervise every aspect of the building. At the same time, he was faced with the task of getting the ring designed and constructed, and finding a cast, orchestra and chorus, and training his long-suffering conductor, Hans Richter. Wagner had endless squabbles with his singers, for often the right voice came with the wrong shape, or the other way round. His problem was to create an ensemble out of nothing, and it's a problem that exists to this day. Then there was the technical apparatus, like the dangerous-looking devices which were supposed to make the Rhine maidens appear to be swimming in the very first scene of Das Rheingold. By August 1876, the theatre was ready, and so began the first pilgrimage up the Green Hill. An international audience poured into Bayreuth and caught the town unawares. Hotel accommodation was woefully inadequate, and a shortage of food and restaurant space led to a struggle for existence. The eccentric Ludwig, who had made it all possible, came incognito to the rehearsals. Then the Kaiser arrived with a great deal of pomp and ceremony, and congratulated Wagner with the words, "I didn't believe you'd ever accomplish it." Yet even Wagner himself admitted that he was uncertain about what he was trying to achieve. The audience was summoned to the theatre by fanfare from whatever work they were about to hear, practice which continues to this day. Many people who were there for the first complete ring may have seen the first two parts when they were performed some years earlier in Munich. But what did they make of part 3 when Siegfried the hero forges an invincible sword in the presence of the evil dwarf Mime, whose intention is to kill Siegfried? Did they get the point that Siegfried is an innocent rather than a German Superman? In 1975, Siegfried was sung by Ian Cox. Perhaps the audience today understands Siegfried a bit better, but it still isn't the kind of audience that Wagner really wanted. What he wanted was a young audience rather than a fashion parade. He wanted to reach ordinary people as well as princesses. All the same, the Bayreuth experience is unlike any other. There's very little to do except attend the performances and think about the dramas, which is exactly what Wagner expected. The fact that it's an elegant audience isn't really surprising when you consider that a single seat can cost up to £26. Because the performances usually start at 4 in the afternoon, the intervals are long and leisurely, and you can make a choice between a relaxed but expensive meal in the restaurant adjoining the theatre, or, if your tastes are more Bavarian, you can have beer and German sausages from a stall. Nobody cares whether you do one or the other, because everyone's talking about what has just happened on the stage and about what is to happen next. It was just the same 100 years ago, except that, whereas today it's quite easy to get to Bayreuth, it must have required quite an expedition in 1876. Yet such was the magnetism of Wagner and his music that people, friends and foes, found their way to Bayreuth from all over the world, from as far away as Saigon and the Cape of Good Hope. And when they got there, they signed the guest book to show where they'd come from. The Emperor of Brazil was there, and so were Grieg, Bruckner, Liszt, Nicolai, Rubinstein and Saint-Saëns. Tchaikovsky also came and said, if the vast work is doomed and the Bayreuth Theatre sinks into perpetual sleep, still, the Ring constitutes one of the most colossal artistic enterprises ever to be conceived in the mind of man. Wagner certainly convinced Tchaikovsky, but some were puzzled by the last work, Götterdämmerung, for at this late hour, Wagner had reconciled himself to the idea that what he called the artwork of the future could still incorporate older operatic conventions. Hagen, the evil genius of Götterdämmerung, sung by Karl Ridderbusch, has a private army which sings his praises in a good old-fashioned chorus number. The first production of The Ring ended with a huge deficit. It also confirmed Wagner's genius and his megalomania, his monumental ego. Saint-Saëns wrote of him that even his admirers admit that his rudeness is as great as his talent. Meanwhile, the cartoonists had the time of their lives trying to undermine his megalomania. Yet they couldn't avoid the fact that everything he said, everything he did, and everything he wrote was news, even if it didn't make money. No other composer in the history of music had ever received such international attention. Soon he had to leave Bayreuth to conduct concerts in London to reduce the deficit. Everyone exploited him. Meat extract manufacturers used scenes from his private life to sell their product, while the French composers Fauré and Messager wrote this set of tongue-in-cheek quadrilles based on The Ring. Wagner had been far from satisfied with the 1876 production of The Ring. In a letter to King Ludwig, he said that, having found a way of making the orchestra disappear, he wished he could now do the same for the stage. And after the final performance, he wrote in another letter, "The German capacity for bungling in almost every sphere of art is unique. And you can understand why the cartoonists made fun of his sets and costumes if you take a look at what some of the originals were like." Wagner was a great traveller, but he always came back to Bayreuth, which was the first permanent home he'd ever had. His wife Cosima, the daughter of Franz Liszt and his junior by 24 years, knew as well as Wagner that the festival had been a financial disaster and an artistic compromise. They lived in a house which Wagner called Winifred, a name which symbolizes a place of refuge, a place where he could work in peace, hold musical evenings with Liszt and other relatives, and above all to draw around him his family, because whatever else may be said about him, Wagner was essentially a family man. Lack of cash kept the theatre closed for 5 seasons, but Wagner continued to work on what was to be his final composition, Parsifal. Parsifal is an innocent who, in losing his innocence, restores to the Knights of the Holy Grail the spear with which Christ was pierced during the crucifixion. When Bayreuth reopened in 1882, just to stage Parsifal, there were many who were offended by the portrayal of Holy Communion on the stage. Their objections must have deafened them to some of Wagner's greatest music. In February 1883, Wagner died in Venice. His body was brought back to Bayreuth, where, in The Ring and Parsifal, he'd sought to make his impossible vision possible. He was buried in a simple grave in the garden of his house, Winifred. At the age of 70, the world lost a man who had changed the very language of music and whose impact and influence can still be felt to this day. Cosima Wagner took over the running of the theatre. Parsifal was revived in 1883, And then, in the next 15 festivals, she went on to fulfill her husband's dream of mounting his major operas at Bayreuth. At the same time, she was training her successor, her son, Siegfried, who was 14 at the time of his father's death. His mother tried to keep from the world anything that might reflect adversely on her late husband, and jealously guarded the family archives under lock and key. She turned Winifred into a shrine where nothing could be moved, and where the dust was allowed to settle even on the master's piano. And 20 years after the first festival, she finally revived the Ring with an obsessive veneration for every last detail of Wagner's original production. Siegfried Wagner took over the festival in 1908 when he was 39. At first, he sought to maintain the traditions rigidly established by his mother, but like his father, he tried to do everything, and maybe tried to do too much. He advised on scenic design and costumes, and he produced. He even composed 13 operas, but he never attempted to get them performed at Bayreuth. He was better known as a conductor. He was a modest, sensitive artist who worked hard and withstood with surprising determination the still powerful influence of his mother, Cosima. But for all Siegfried Wagner's energy and endeavor, he was not a genius. It was his destiny and his misfortune to spend his life under a heavy shadow. In 1915, war closed the festival. Troops drilled outside the theatre. There was no longer a fashionable audience queuing for performances, but troops lining up for soup and bread. The restaurant was turned into a dormitory, and the machine room became a communal bath. When war broke out, Siegfried Wagner was 45 and unmarried. But in 1914, a 17-year-old English girl called Winifred Williams was taken to Bayreuth, where she met Siegfried Wagner. It was, she said, love at first sight. It was his kind, warm voice and his wonderful blue eyes that enchanted me. I was entranced. She married Siegfried in 1915 and assumed German nationality. She was 18 and he was 46. It was her unenviable task to win the confidence of the family, but with Siegfried's help, Cosima at least accepted her. Today, Winifred Wagner leads a full life. At 79, she still lives in the house that Siegfried built in the grounds of Winifred. After their marriage, it wasn't long before Siegfried and Winifred began to raise a family. In 1917, they presented Cosima with a grandson called Wieland. Within a space of 2 years came a daughter called Frieda and another son, Wolfgang. And finally, in 1920, another daughter, Verena. The Wagner dynasty was secure. Post-war inflation prevented Siegfried from reopening the festival until 1924. Then, with the limited money he'd earned from concert tours, he managed to revive a production of The Ring. It wasn't new, but over the next few years he was able to bring about some changes by adopting a solid, structural kind of scenery and by using a cyclorama. With more sophisticated lighting, he was able to trim away some of the superfluities, which had been part of the pre-war Bayreuth style. Cosima, who was by then 87, certainly didn't approve, but then she'd never approved of change. In 1930, the great Italian conductor Toscanini came to Bayreuth to take charge of a new Tannhäuser, with Siegfried as the producer. It was a new, welcome injection of fresh blood, but for Siegfried, it was to be a year of tragedy. In April, his mother Cosima died at the age of 93, and 4 months later, during the rehearsal period, Siegfried himself suffered a heart attack and died. That marked the end of Bayreuth's third era: Richard Wagner, Cosima Wagner, and Siegfried Wagner. With Winifred Wagner, the mother of Siegfried's 4 children, the line, the Wagner succession, was still secure. She was only 33 when, in 1931, she began to run the festival. She inherited Toscanini and brought in the great German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler. But the 2 conductors didn't get on, and Toscanini left for good. By 1933, Winifred had appointed Heinz Tietjen of the Berlin State Opera as artistic director of the Bayreuth Festival. And before long, the 3 of them, Tietjen, Furtwängler, and Winifred Wagner, together with the designer Emil Pretorius, were working closely together to preserve and improve the standards set by their predecessors. Although money was still scarce, they wanted the very best artists and were determined to get them. In this rehearsal for Götterdämmerung in 1937, the pictures and sound may not always synchronize, but the artists being watched by Winifred and Tietjen are Frieda Leider and Max Lorenz. Under Winifred Wagner's direction, the festival continued to draw the crown heads of Europe. The King of Bulgaria came, and so did the Crown Prince of Denmark. Royalty has always been drawn to Bayreuth. Between the wars, the festival was very much a European social occasion. Richard Strauss not only visited the festival as a spectator, but conducted there as well. But there was one visitor who mattered more to Winifred Wagner than any other. Adolf Hitler had been a regular visitor to Bayreuth long before he came to power. He was on close terms with the Wagner family in the 1920s, and he had a passion for Wagner's music, though possibly for all the wrong reasons. The Wagner grandchildren regarded Hitler as their uncle. They even called him Uncle Wolfie. He encouraged Wieland in his painting studies, which led to Wieland's engagement as designer for the 1937 Parsifal in Bayreuth. Like all others of their age, Wieland and Wolfgang became members of the Hitler Youth. But when war broke out in 1939, Hitler exempted Wieland from military service to ensure the line of Wagnerian succession. Wolfgang joined the army and was badly wounded. So too was Wagner's music when Hitler adopted a theme from The Ring as the official march for his Nuremberg rallies. As a climax to the rallies, and at his own personal expense, Hitler arranged for special performances of Die Meistersinger to take place in Nuremberg, where its action is set. This and The Merry Widow were his favorite works.
Auf Anordnung des Führers wurden trotz des Krieges die Bayreuther Festspiele 19...
When war was declared in 1939, Bayreuth stayed open. It was to Winifred's credit that she arranged special dispensation so that Jewish artists who were otherwise banned could appear there. But now it was a different audience. It was an audience in uniform, an audience drawn from the KDF movement, a movement supposed to find strength through joy. And the visitor who mattered more than anyone still found time to come and gain a reception that was even more rapturous than before.
Die Ankunft des Führers. Frau Winifred Wagner, die Hüterin des Erbes von Bayreuth, und Reichsleiter Dr. Ley empfangen den Führer am Portal des Festspielhauses. In den Pausen brachten die Zuschauer dem Führer begeisterte Dankeskundgebungen dar.
Exceptional precautions were taken to keep the Bayreuth Festival going in the war years. Air raid shelters were built around the theatre, and to protect factory workers and the trainloads of war wounded who'd earned themselves a trip to Bayreuth, dugouts were built. All of these privileged visitors had a book of vouchers, meal tickets, tour of the town tickets, free wine tickets for the intervals, but above all, tickets for a performance. These were very different pilgrims from those who'd walked up the Green Hill before the war. Even the fanfares to summon the audience were still played, though now by a helmeted military band. In 1944, there was, as always, a member of the Wagner family to greet the officials. It was Winifred. This was the year of the Second Front. The Russians were on the offensive in the east, and this time Hitler had to send a deputy. But Bayreuth was not allowed to close, and there was a production of Die Meistersinger with Wieland Wagner as designer. This was the center of Bayreuth when it was all over. Winifred, Wagner's house, was severely damaged, and yet, miraculously, his piano survived, and a GI had his picture taken sitting there as a souvenir. The theater wasn't damaged at all, and the occupying American troops put it to uses no one could have dreamt of. The restaurant was a refugee camp, while the theater became a location for religious services with special areas allocated to Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. It was also used for all kinds of popular entertainment. The theater's props and costumes were plundered, and the stage was extended to cover Wagner's sunken orchestral pit. What went on was a far cry from the ring, let alone Parsifal. There were also concerts of light music for the American Army of Occupation and occasional opera performances by visiting companies. But Wagner's music was forbidden because his name was still associated with the Nazis. Certainly, Winifred Wagner couldn't deny her friendship with Hitler. In 1947, Winifred Wagner faced a denazification court which, not surprisingly, found her guilty of collaboration with the regime. She appealed, and the penalties were reduced. But in no circumstances was she to be allowed to reopen the festival herself. The fact was that her late husband Siegfried had left the theater to her in trust for his sons. So in these circumstances, she handed over the theater to Wieland and Wolfgang and undertook to play no part in running any future festival. Even today, this extraordinary woman has never gone back on her political views. She has been denounced by her children, by her daughter Frieda, who went in disgust to America during the Hitler era, by Wieland 1 year before his death, and last year she was banned from the opening of the festival. The new Bayreuth began under Wieland and Wolfgang in 1951. The brothers divided their responsibility. Wieland created a revolution in trying to turn Wagner's impossible visions into practical realities, while Wolfgang managed the house and raised cash, because there was still very little money. It was with Hans Knappersbusch, a great Wagner conductor, that the brothers sought to build up a team. He conducted in every festival but one between 1951 and his death in 1965. Of his approach to Parsifal, the critic Ernest Newman wrote affectionately that he seemed not to be conducting time, but eternity. But above all, it was the unity of the brothers that mattered, for their task was to give a new look to Wagner for a new generation. Another vital member of the team was Wilhelm Pitz, the greatest German chorus master of his time, and perhaps the greatest chorus master in the world. Working from scratch, he had to assemble his chorus from all over Europe, holding auditions in all the major opera houses. The Bayreuth chorus responded. They loved him and sang for him as they would have sung for no one else.
Nein, das wird das Piano hier. Die Schwere, die ich errate wird. Von unten so herauf nochmal. Jetzt ab. 1, 2, 3. Die Schwere, die ich erreichen wieder rein. Das erste Reich, der Reichen Gustav wird dich erreichen, die ich erreichen.
Wieland Wagner's approach to producing the Ring was to strip it of inessentials, to get down to what his grandfather had really been trying to convey. Wieland knew that the Ring was a myth, and that it had nothing to do with realism and conventional styles of operatic acting or movement.
Hinausgeworfen durch den Albrecht. Ja. Sie werden aus dem Paradieseszustand hinausgeworfen.
He threw the focus back onto the music, and in 1951 he wrote, "Today we must still accept that the stage can, at its best, provide only a sparse reflection of what the orchestra pit is triumphantly conveying to our ears." Wieland taught his singers to think about the meaning of their words and to grasp that although the Ring takes place in an unreal world, everything in it relates, or should relate, to the eternal issues that are constantly facing mankind. He eliminated the element of pantomime, which so easily creeps into productions of the Ring. Here he's rehearsing Erwin Wolfhard as Mime in Greindl. In Wieland's approach, every gesture, every movement and every nuance of characterization had to be relevant to the emotional undercurrents of his grandfather's epic creation.
Wie es zu schwunden. Unmerklich klingen die Fähig mächtige Kraft zu eigenem Werk, das aus Erz sich wohnt. Für mich drum hüten wollt ich den Helm durch seinen Zauber allmächtig Zwang. Wie kennt sich vielleicht, ja vielleicht den Listen, Sexualisten, in meine Gewalt ihn zu werfen, den Ring ihn zu reißen, lasst mich recht jetzt den Grünen.
Wieland Wagner's visionary approach to lighting and design was equally revolutionary. In the second scene of Rheingold, there was a symbolical castle rather than a real one, while in the first act of Die Walküre, he got rid of the hut in the forest where Siegmund meets Sieglinde and set the mood by lighting rather than by scenery. In the prelude to Götterdämmerung, there was simply the brightest of blue skies for Siegfried and Brunhilde, who appeared on a circular acting area. He even applied a similar formal approach to a much earlier work, Lohengrin, where he grouped the chorus geometrically around another circle.
Jetzt ein Leben magst du Hörerei, es war
But it was not until 1956 that Wieland Wagner produced Die Meistersinger, and then it looked very different. Act One no longer had a recognizable church. Symbolism, in the form of a fretted altarpiece, had taken over from realism. One of his innovations was to represent Eva and Walter in the form of Adam and Eve as part of the set. Critics and public alike were puzzled. They were even more puzzled when it came to Act Two. No street, no shop, no houses. Instead, there was a Midsummer Night symbol. Suddenly, light and colour had replaced scenery. The tradition of a realistic Meistersinger had not so much been broken as smashed to pieces. And the end of Act 3, the scene in the meadow, became a tableau, disciplined, precise, and yet somehow lacking in humanity. In 1957, Wieland made some extensive modifications. As always, he was following his grandfather's command to seek something new. His changes in Act 2, though still a long way from realism, did produce a beautiful stage picture. And the chorus groupings in Act 3, although still very formal and static, did focus attention on the music marvelously. In 1963, Wieland Wagner went in yet another direction. His costumes were based on the paintings of Bruegel, and his set resembled a Shakespearean stage with a gallery all the way round, which stayed in place for all 3 acts. It was an attempt to recreate the theatre of the 16th century, and neither the critics nor the public liked it much. But again, it sought to emphasize the music above everything else. Wieland always let the music speak in such moments as the quintet in Act 3. Over the years, Wieland's productions attracted the greatest Wagner singers in the world, some of whom came not for financial gain, but for prestige, for the artistic experience of appearing in Bayreuth. For the new production of The Ring in 1965, Birgit Nilsson, Josef Greindl and Thomas Stewart came together for the Vengeance Trio in Götterdämmerung. During rehearsals for the festival in 1966, Wieland Wagner was taken ill. He missed the festival, and on October the 17th of that year, he died. He was 49. His death was not just an almost unbelievable, unbearable shock for Bayreuth, but for the world of opera in general. His reputation had spread far beyond the bounds of Bayreuth, and his repertoire took in many composers other than Wagner. He was an original, and although some of his work was controversial, it was never, never dull. He was a perfectionist who was never satisfied, any more than his grandfather was. Richard Wagner had constantly urged those around him to do something different. Wieland did just that in his quest for the impossible vision. There are few operatic producers of whom it can be said that their work influenced an entire generation, but it's true of Wieland Wagner. His 1951 Bayreuth production of Parsifal held the stage for 24 years and so outlived him by 8 years. Wieland was buried at his father's side. Once again, the whole future of the Bayreuth Festival was in doubt. Again, the solution came from within the family. Wolfgang Wagner assumed control of the festival in 1967. To begin with, he asked Wieland Wagner's assistant, Peter Lehmann, to keep Wieland's productions alive by re-rehearsing those operas, and especially Parsifal, on which they had worked so closely together. But this was a temporary arrangement, for Wolfgang Wagner was far from being just a manager. He'd learned his craft as a producer during the war in Berlin, and as early as 1953, he directed Lohengrin in Bayreuth. In 1960, he tackled The Ring, and yet for all this, he's never received either the acclaim or the criticism extended to his brother. But no one questions his very real skills as a producer, and as an administrator, he's greatly admired by artists who come to sing at Bayreuth from all over the world.
I think it's the atmosphere here. This very, very special atmosphere is almost like being a part of a very big and wonderful family. Wolfgang Wagner is like a father to us all. He's wonderful. He's always there just when you need him.
I think I was most impressed of all with Wolfgang Wagner himself, with the extraordinary atmosphere that seems to radiate from him through the whole Festspiel.
I think it is a fantastic place. It is marvelously organized. Wolfgang, I think, is probably the best organizer of opera that I have ever come across.
Everyone in Bayreuth is totally dedicated to Wagner and the family and to perpetuating his memory, really.
Not the money and not the honor that everybody always talks of Bayreuth and honor. It's just the love of Wagner.
Wolfgang Wagner has carried on the tradition of the new Bayreuth, but unlike his late brother, he's not a revolutionary producer, though in his own way he's retained the basic idea of simplicity of production which originated in 1951. Wolfgang always establishes a warm relationship with his artists and looks for new approaches to characterization, even in a scene as familiar as the Ride of the Valkyries. It's a process of endless rethinking, endless renewal. Wolfgang added an extra dimension by the use of light through multiple projections. All the same, he still retained the circular acting area that has always been part of the new Bayreuth Ring. Now Wolfgang moves on to that great scene when Brunhilde, Gwyneth Jones, hands the fragments of Siegmund's sword to Sieglinde, Marita Napier, and tells her she will bear Siegmund's child and that his name will be Siegfried. even after 100 years, the social splendors of Bayreuth after a premiere have in no way diminished. And it's sometimes a bit hard to believe that this fashionable audience on its way to a grand reception in the new palace has really been moved in the way that Wagner intended when he wrote The Ring. Have primeval doubts and fears been aroused? What about the total theatrical experience that Wagner demanded? Has the music touched those instincts that can only be reached through the retelling of a myth? Over the years, the craft of theatre production has steadily developed, and yet the vision remains a paradox. It's practical in the sense that it can always be attempted, but it's endlessly renewable, endlessly changing, and it's certain to change again in 1976. Wolfgang Wagner is the guest of honor. The reception is now a Bavarian state occasion because since 1973, Bayreuth has undergone one radical change. Through the foundation of the Richard Wagner Stiftung, a trust initiated by Winifred and Wolfgang Wagner, the theatre, Winifred, and the Wagner archives have been donated to the nation. In return, the state has guaranteed continuing financial support so long as a member of the Wagner family remains to manage the festival. As director, Wolfgang is accountable for the theatre's expenditure, but he's allowed complete artistic freedom. On another night, in a different part of town, the orchestra and chorus have their own much less formal party, accompanied by a bizarre combination of gypsy music and tunes from Wagner's operas on the bassoons.
What about your sausage? Why don't you don't give me a bite? I'll put it on you.
The artists, too, have their own party. On stage, Wotan may find it hard to forgive his disobedient daughter, Brunhilde. But offstage, they're just Donald McIntyre and Gwyneth Jones having a good time. The next morning's rehearsal, the last scene of Die Walküre, leading up to the moment when Brunhilde makes her final plea for forgiveness. There's no merriment here. What Wolfgang Wagner is seeking is sheer dramatic intensity. It's this man who carries on the heritage of Bayreuth, but who, in this centenary year, has chosen to stand down as the producer of The Ring. For the first time since 1951, the only Wagner whose name will be attached to the new Ring production will be that of Richard, the composer. Thus may begin a new era in Bayreuth. But Wolfgang Wagner's production of the Ring will not be forgotten. So Bayreuth has survived its first 100 years, including 2 devastating wars, endless financial constraints, and a family divided among itself. But nevertheless, the family has struggled to do justice to the works of Richard Wagner. It was Siegfried who said in 1925, "It is not granted to us humans to achieve perfection, but to strive after it is a consummation devoutly to be wished." Wagner's impossible vision, the perfect fusion of music and drama and production to provide an unparalleled experience, may not yet have been perfectly realized, but that has never and will never stop people from trying. And if it ever happens, it's most likely to happen here, in the theatre that was built for it, on the green hill outside Bayreuth. For the actual contest. So Beckmesser's merriment is misjudged. Of course, it's Walter's song that's going to win in the end, and the man who's going to sing it, René Collo, is rehearsing as he flies into Bayreuth in his own aircraft.
Was ist am Lust verlassen?
There's Bayreuth down.
In the first Bayreuth production of 1888, the Act 3 backdrop showed the towers of Nuremberg, as seen from the meadow where the song contest takes place. Because Meistersinger is a comedy, even if it has its melancholy undertones, it's usual to present it with realistic settings. In that first production, Act 2 was quite clearly a street, with Sachs's cobbler's shop on the left, opposite the house where Pugner and his daughter Eva lived. The idea was to recreate the atmosphere of 16th century Nuremberg, even down to some details of St. Catherine's Church in Act 1. 45 years later, nothing much changed for a new production in 1933. The realistic tradition had been maintained but modified, and the same went for the street in Act 2. In 1944, Meistersinger was the only work to be performed in the last Bayreuth Festival before the end of the war, and the designer of that production was the composer's other grandson, Wieland, then aged 27. When the festival reopened in 1951, Wolfgang Wagner emerged as a producer of startling originality. But it was not until 1956 that he produced Die Meistersinger, and then it looked very different. Act 1 no longer had a recognizable church. Symbolism, in the form of a fretted altarpiece, had taken over from realism. One of his innovations was to represent Eva and Walter in the form of Adam and Eve as part of the set. Critics and public alike were puzzled. They were even more puzzled when it came to Act 2. No street, no shop, no houses. Instead, there was a Midsummer Night symbol. Suddenly, light and colour had replaced scenery. The tradition of a realistic Meistersinger had not so much been broken as smashed to pieces. And the end of Act 3, the scene in the meadow, became a tableau, disciplined, precise, and yet somehow lacking in humanity. And the chorus groupings in Act 3, although still very formal and static, did focus attention on the music marvelously.
Sing-Jung.
In 1963, Wieland Wagner went in yet another direction. His costumes were based on the paintings of Bruegel, and his set resembled a Shakespearean stage with a gallery all the way round, which stayed in place for all 3 acts. It was an attempt to recreate the theatre of the 16th century, and neither the critics nor the public liked it much. But again, it sought to emphasize the music above everything else. Wieland always let the music speak in such moments as the quintet in Act 3. Wieland Wagner was thinking of the centennial production of Meistersinger when he died at the age of 49 in 1966. What is certain is that his approach would again have been fresh and provocative. What is also certain is that the world of opera lost a genius who in a mere 15 years had revolutionized production techniques. But the festival had to go on. Wach auf, sing the chorus. It means awaken. It's a call to revival and renewal. And so everything now passed to Wieland's brother Wolfgang, who, though a thoroughly experienced producer in his own right, had never before tackled the problems of Meistersinger. Wolfgang's approach was to put the humanity back into Meistersinger, to restore a degree of realism and to capture the spirit of Bavarian festivities. You can see the warmth of his personality in the way he handled the chorus, and his production for the 100th anniversary of the first production held the stage until 1975. Significantly, it's the finale of Meistersinger that Wolfgang has chosen to mark the opening of the 1976 festival and the centenary of Bayreuth. He's an extremely self-critical man who feels that this shows his work at its best. And it's typical of his personality that he wants to be associated with Die Meistersinger more than any other of his grandfather's works. And so, once again, the fanfare to Meistersinger summons people from all over the world to the theatre on the hill at Bayreuth. People come to Bayreuth not only for the music, but because they want to hear it in Wagner's theatre, in the atmosphere, and with the acoustic that he himself created, and which has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. Backstage, the chorus and singers are also feeling a special responsibility because this is Bayreuth. Here's Hans Sotin playing Pogner, Eva's father, making his way towards the stage. He's followed by Karl Ridderbusch as Hans Sachs, the cobbler poet, who's the real hero. Then there's Klaus Hirter as the pedantic town clerk, Beckmesser. Anna Reynolds, who plays Magdalena, accompanies Marita Napier as Eva. And finally, there's Frieda Stricker, who sings David, the apprentice. There's no break between the scenes of Meistersinger Act 3, and Wagner left precious little time to move the action from the intimacy of Hans Sachs's home to the festival site on the meadow outside Nuremberg. In less than a minute from now, the guilds will parade. First will come the shoemakers, then the tailors, then the bakers, followed by all the other guilds and their apprentices, ready for a day of rejoicing and festivities. Then come the masters with their wives, and finally, Hans Sachs. He's given a huge welcome by the townsfolk of Nuremberg. The contest begins with Beckmesser singing the words he thinks were written by Hans Sachs to a pathetic tune of his own. It's a disaster, of course, because the words won't fit. As Beckmesser departs in a fury, Sachs explains that the words will be fine if sung by the man who wrote the right tune. Walter steps forward, sings his song, and wins the heart of the populace and the hand of Eva. At the end, Sachs asks for the preservation of German arts and crafts in a passage which is often misunderstood as a call to nationalism, whereas all he wants is to preserve tradition. As a consequence, Eva takes the wreath of honor from Walter and gives it to Hans Sachs. And as Wolfgang Wagner cues curtain up, here is the final scene of Die Meistersinger.
Der Teufel soll dich an sich, als ich